Tack så mycket. Very welcome, Patrick Cockburn. Before saying anything else, I have to tell you and the audience that I'm not generally a jealous person, but I am jealous of Patrick's reporting because, unlike most journalists, he is always able to combine analysis with eyewitness accounts and very reporting full of imagery from the ground. And you have recently been to Syria.
Yeah.
Tell us, what did you see?
Damascus, actually a little better than it was 2 years ago. I normally stay in the Christian quarter, Bab Touma, in the old city, and there were mortar bombs coming down then, and not heavy casualties, but there were people being killed and wounded every day. That's not happening in quite the same way now, slightly more secure. People tired of war, but in a way almost used to war. It reminds me of the Lebanese civil war between 75 and for 15 years afterwards. A sort of exhaustion, but lots of people who've known very little else but war.
This was also a war where there were 600 ceasefires during the Lebanese civil war, and people are very skeptical towards any ceasefire. Now the latest one has gone up in smoke.
Well, no, hold on a minute, hold on a minute. Hold on. I mean, people laugh at 600 ceasefires, but if you're in the street in Beirut, the fact there's a ceasefire on that very day means there's a better chance for people staying alive. So 600 ceasefires are an awful lot better than 600 non-ceasefires.
Yes, exactly. They do save lives, after all.
Lives.
Now, yesterday, many of us saw the drama in New York between Lavrov and Kerry, where John Kerry was describing the situation as parallel universes. What they were talking about was, of course, the bombing of the aid convoy. What did you make of that? And who do you think was responsible?
First of all, I don't know, but this is horrible, but it's part of the general horror. And you'll know very well, Cecilia, people who carry out bombing, whether it's in Iraq or Syria or Afghanistan, always pretend it's more accurate than it is. You know, I've been in an Afghan village with craters 20 feet deep. Obviously, it was the Americans. The American spokesman was claiming it was Taliban with grenades had done it, obviously untrue. The weekend before, the Americans, the British, and I think the Danes bombed the Syrian army, killed 62 people, wounded 100 others.
But they admitted that.
Yeah, but I mean, it's because they couldn't deny it, really. But my point I'm trying to make is that people who carry out bombing always pretend it's more accurate than it is. And then when they go and kill aid workers, bomb an aid convoy, they're caught by their own rhetoric and propaganda. That how come people say, well, you must have done it deliberately. But no, this is always part of these bombing campaigns, and it underlines the necessity in Syria of having long-term ceasefires, because these are just the mishits we know about. And Syria is full of mishits we don't know about people who are buried in graves, nobody knows where they are. And when you think of how many antagonists there are in Syria, and how closely they are together, that this is a horrible but inevitable part of the conflict.
But the Russians and/or Syrians did not admit to having bombed an aid convoy by mistake, which is why John Kerry was saying, does anybody believe this after the Russians...
Sure, that's reasonable for him to say. It is presumably them, and then people... But at the same time, I think that the Lavrov and Kerry, Russia and the US are the only real chance of having a de-escalation of violence in Syria, for the simple reason that they are the main powers. the US a superpower, the Russia sort of would-be superpower, and potentially they have influence over their allies, proxies, and others to force them to abide by ceasefires. But this assumes two things. One, that both sides really want to do that and really make an effort to do that, but it's not going to be easy. And secondly, that their proxies are going to, and allies are going to respond. Because none of these people, none of the proxies trust their main backers, and none of the backers really trust their own proxies.
Now, you wrote early on that everybody was making the mistake of assuming that Bashar al-Assad would fall, governments as well as journalists. Why did everyone make that mistake, and how should they have done otherwise in the beginning of this revolt?
I always thought it was fairly obvious on the ground in Syria that Assad wasn't going to go. I mean, people were predicting his immediate departure. There are 14 provincial capitals in Syria. They were predicting his departure when he held 13 of them. You know, this was just against common sense. The Syrian army hadn't split. The fact that the opposition, not the political opposition, but the armed opposition from an early stage was dominated by Islamists, because that's where the trained fighters came from, also forced the minorities, people, Sunni who were secular, established urban Sunni, onto the government side. Didn't much mean they liked Assad, but the alternative for them was much worse. So I thought, for just looking at the political geography of Syria at the time, looking at the consequences of the development of the armed opposition being dominated by extreme Islamists, that he wasn't going to go, as indeed he didn't.
And when did you realize this from the start? I mean, was this very early on in 2011 that you came to that conclusion?
Well, it really only got going sort of later on. I'd sort of, once the Russians, the other thing, you know, how did it differ from Libya? Why did people think this at the time? Well, I think they were thinking about Libya. 2011, Gaddafi had gone. But Libya, very different from Syria, as you know, that Assad had a core of support, sectarian support within the country, and secondly, he had the backing of Russia and Iran in a way that Gaddafi did not. So the political situation was visibly very different. But I think this analogy was in their minds, and that's why there was a sort of general belief that somehow Assad was going to go like Gaddafi had gone at the end of 2011. At the time also there was just sort of wishful thinking, particularly among the opposition. I remember going to Damascus in early 2012, and I'd been having a cup of coffee with a rather nice Syrian exiled film director in Beirut. And we'd been chatting about things. And when I got back from, I'd written that Assad wasn't going to go. And when I got back just across the Lebanese border, I switched on my Lebanese phone. And there was this same film director screaming at me down the phone, saying, "Shame on you, shame on the Independent," the newspaper for which I work. "Why are you saying these things, that Assad is going to stay?" And I said, "Just the reasons I've just given." But he kept on sort of screaming down the phone. Because for a lot of people who had hoped for a transition to democracy, secular democracy in Syria, there was wishful thinking then, and I fear wishful thinking now.
So would you say that the revolution or the uprising was doomed from the start? I mean, after all, it started with little kids scribbling anti-regime slogans on walls, and it very quickly became an Islamist uprising. I remember going to Damascus quite early on, meeting young activists who said, "I'm beginning to feel uneasy about this, because when we leave a mosque with a protest, the only chants that really are received enthusiastically are the ones that have an Islamist connotation. Anything else that sounds liberal, secular, or just plain democratic aren't received with the same amount of enthusiasm. And this was pretty early. But was it doomed from the beginning to become a jihadi uprising?
No, I think that you can sort of join up too many dots, so to speak. I think there was a likelihood because, and this was true of Libya as well, you know, people who wanted a secular democratic revolution, but who were the outside backers? Well, they were, you know, financial backers, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the Gulf monarchies, the last arbitrary Islamic fundamentalist states, wholly authoritarian on earth. Is it likely that they would back democracy? Is it likely they wanted a secular government? Absolutely not. Secondly, the divisions within Syria were always sectarian. It was a primarily Alawite government, not entirely, but largely. The vehicle for protest, as in other parts of the Arab world, was the Muslim Brotherhood, that other vehicles had been eliminated by the government, but were always weak. So there was always a likelihood it could go down that line. And it was always a line that was going to have frustrating consequences because it immediately created a lot of enemies of people who maybe they didn't much like Assad, but just as you mentioned, these secular protesters, that the alternative was far more threatening. And so if you're a minority, a member of minority in Syria, you know, this is going to be your head. The women are going to be reduced to the status of, you know, of chattels, of near slaves. At best, you're going to lose your job if you're a secular Sunni. So all these people were threatened and were forced onto Assad's side.
And how do you see the American involvement in the Syrian debacle? I mean, if we look at American foreign policy today in the region, the Americans are on the one hand supporting a Shia state in Iraq, which is loyal to Iran, and they are supporting Saudi Arabia's war on Shias, the Houthis in Yemen. They are warming up to Iran. They are indirectly supporting jihadis, so-called moderate rebels in Syria. Is this like a sort of hedge funding of foreign policy, putting your bets everywhere?
Well, first of all powers try to bet on all the numbers. You don't want to walk away a loser. So you need some reinsurance policies. I think that there's something rather important, decisive happening, which is that before 2003, there was a picture in the rest of the world, particularly in the Middle East region, of total American hegemony. The Americans got what they wanted, and the Americans themselves believed this to a degree. But because of the Iraq war, a big American army in Iraq, and eventually they failed to get what they want. Same thing in Afghanistan. That American hegemony, American overlordship, is less than it was and is perceived as less. Maybe there's an exaggerated idea of American weakness among the powers and people in the Middle East at the moment. So the Americans are caught between wanting to end the war. I think they genuinely do, and I think they're the people most likely to go down that road. But they want to maintain their relations with the big Sunni powers. They want to retain the status quo in the Middle East, which is much in their interest. And this has been the problem since 9/11. You know, whatever the exact details, it's pretty evident that 9/11, the connections were all Saudi. 15 out of 19 hijackers are Saudi, Osama's are Saudi. The private money probably came from Saudi. But they didn't go there because they don't want to go after their own allies and, in a sense, destabilize a situation which is in their interests. Same thing.
But why not?
Sorry.
I mean, everybody would say that, yeah, it's the oil, it's because of the oil. Oil is not that important anymore. All right, exporting weapons to Saudi Arabia may be important, but why? If almost everybody agrees that Wahhabism, the conservative, reactionary ideology of Saudi Arabia is one of the biggest dangers in the world, why isn't the US doing more to distance itself?
Very good question. You know, how far did this happen? Are they just continuing traditional policies? The Saudis are very eager to back this up, you know, and at all sorts of levels. buying arms is one of them. Oil companies is another. I agree that, you know, oil isn't quite what it was, but, you know, but one feels that if the main export of Iraq or Saudi Arabia, you know, was cauliflowers or carrots rather than oil, there wouldn't be so much there wouldn't be so much international interest in it. But there's also quite concrete things, you know, that the number of US, indeed British ambassadors who've been to Saudi Arabia, who are very, you couldn't get them to appear on TV afterwards, say anything critical, because they have that nice little job as a consultant to a British or American company usually selling arms to Saudi Arabia. Or they have a nice little think tank to which, or a big think tank, to which the Saudis are big contributors.
So you mean it's all hypocrisy and corruption?
An awful lot of it, yeah. I think one can be quite crude about some of this. But I mean, there are lots of other reasons that Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Turkey are a part of the fundamental structure of American authority in the air, in the world, and they don't want to sort of saw off the branch they're sitting on. They don't want to erode the very structure on which American power is based, although they can intermittently see that it's this same powers, these Wahhabi powers, that have been promoters and of Wahhabism, which has led to Islamic State and Al-Qaeda.
And how do you explain the about turn of Saudi Arabia from having, not explicitly, but after all funded many of the jihadist movements operating in Syria? Suddenly they started stopping their own from going to Syria to fight, and Prince Bandar was fired, Prince Mohammed bin Nayef was promoted. He is the person who has started the Jihad Rehab Center as well in Riyadh. What happened? Was it just that
I think they wanted to have it both ways. They wanted sort of, as it were, to export Islamist revolution to governments they didn't like, notably in Baghdad and Damascus, but they didn't want them operating at home. Not surprisingly, they found that you couldn't have a great big dividing line in between the two, and what you exported at one moment you might be importing, even if you didn't want to, at another. So I think that changed their minds to a degree. But also I think there's a degree of self-deception in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states as to you know, we don't support Islamic State, but al-Nusra is a bit different, and Narar al-Sham is different again. But in fact, it's a fairly homogeneous, it's a much more homogeneous group than it looks. And this isn't just somebody in the Saudi government signing a check. You know, there are plenty of princes who behave like independent monarchs. There are plenty of businesses, other people up and down the Gulf who've got money. And also, I mean, there's another factor. I mean, there's a great big division on who funds these people. And if you talk to actually most Western so-called experts, they say, no, Islamic State is self-funded. But if you talk to people political leaders in Iraqi Kurdistan or in Baghdad, they say, no, funds do come through, partly because Islamic State sends messages to the government in Kuwait and other places saying, if you don't pay up, if somehow money doesn't arrive, you're going to find bombs going off in your backyard as well. I couldn't sort of prove that, but it always seemed to me a bit unlikely that some of the toughest and most violent people in the world in Islamic State do not put pressure on potential sympathizers or the big Gulf oil producers to give them money one way or another.
Patrick Cockburn, our time is up. Unfortunately, we could go on for hours talking about your vast experience in the region. Now, there is a book, and you will be signing it in Swedish, The Return of the Jihadists, and you also have a new book out in English. I'm not sure if it's available here, Chaos and the Caliphate. Both extremely interesting reading with lots of examples from the ground, which I really appreciate very much. Thank you so much, Patrick, for coming here. If you want to hear more from Patrick, come to H1, I think, at 3 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you.